What's up, everyone? Welcome to another class of the Crushing Made Simple Mentorship. You guys let me know if you can hear me well. Wayne Harris says, "Oh, good. Awesome. Thanks, mate." Awesome. Let's get things up and running. You guys should see my screen by now. All right. I think we're good to go. All right, folks. So welcome once again. This is our third main class of the Crushing Made Simple Mentorship. We're entering now our third week of classes. Very happy so far about how things are going. Hopefully, this has been really valuable for you guys as well. I hope that this is the case. And now we're going to continue our explorations in this mentorship with the immediate subject that follows from last week and everything that we talked about last week, right? So last week, we talked about, hopefully this thing is going to work. Okay. Last week, we talked about the real gaps between humans and solvers. We talked about exactly how is that people deviate from solver performance. So there is a level of solver performance, and typically humans are going to fall below that level of solver performance, and then we can identify these gaps. So what are the gaps between human and solver performance? That's what we talked about last week. In the main class, I also gave a complimentary video to you guys about the post-flop MDA in common spots. Hopefully that was very insightful for you guys to see exactly how people tend to deviate from solver in most lines of the game tree. And well, that's what we focused on for last week. Exactly what is that gap? And we encountered a few things when we analyzed human data and also compared that to the TO data. We found that typically humans have two types of gaps. We have the frequency gaps and the range composition gaps. So frequency gaps is exactly about that. So the frequencies of the post-flop nodes are going to be different between humans and solvers. And range composition as well, which refers to the amount and proportion of different hand classes in people's ranges typically are different from solver as well. In terms of frequency mistakes, we saw that people exhibit very significant leaks relative to solver, and we can summarize those leaks as these four frequency mistakes. We saw first the overfolding mistake, which is quite present throughout the game tree, almost all nodes. We saw how in single raise pot in position, for example, 84% of the nodes were getting overfolded, which is really, really crazy to think about. Then we discussed the under raising problem. It seems like humans struggle to raise enough relative to solver in almost all of the spots of the game tree as well. So we talked about that. Then we saw also lack of small bets, lack of depolarized strategies in general for humans relative to solver. We saw how solver really likes using depolarized strategies throughout the game tree. And that's something that regulars and recreationals struggle with, not using them enough. And then we also saw lack of overbets, how solver really likes some very big overbets in a lot of different nodes. And then population typically uses a lot the 3/4 size, regulars in particular, and then recreationals using a lot of half pot bets. So we saw these four types of frequency mistakes. And then when it came to discussing range composition gaps, we saw mostly the problem of river over bluffs. So when we study population tendencies and we study, for example, range compositions on the river, we see typically that both regulars and recreationals are going to be over bluffing quite a lot of different nodes. So we saw this huge gap in performance between solver and humans, right? So this was what we discussed last week. This is what we spent our time studying in depth. And then today, the class goal is to figure out exactly how can we exploit those gaps, right? So what do we do to maximize our EV against these deviations from our opponents, right? That's what we should be trying to answer. That's the question we should try to answer. Not only what are the gaps, but what we can do with that information, right? So last week we focused more on the information side of things. And this week and forward, we're going to focus on what we can do with this information in hand. Okay. Awesome. So, well, the first thing we're going to discuss is how do we exploit the leak of population over folds? How exactly do we take advantage of the fact that it seems people are overfolding significantly relative to solver? Last time we saw a few examples of this problem. One example that I gave in the Pokemate Simple Week, and that I also brought it back here to our classes, was the problem of regulars facing delayed C-bats, right? I showed them a specific board, which was an ace-XX board, where solver folds only 36% of the time facing a small delay C-bat. And then when we take a look at the data, we see regulars folding 54%. And in the model, I wasn't even able to get to 54%. I got to 53%, given how extremely high is the deviation from regulars and solver. So we saw a few of those examples. We saw, for example, how people are performing big blind versus button facing a C-bet, which is supposed to be, well, it is a very common node, not even supposed to be. It is a very common node of the game tree. And it's supposed to be a node that people would be playing very well, but we still see an overfold against all bet sizes on the flop there. Against the 1/3 size, people overfolding 4 to 5% of the time. Against the 2/3 sizing, still overfolding about 6, 5, 7% of the time. And then against the overbet, small overbet, still about 5, 4% overfolds relative to solver. We also saw the behavior of the population against the lazy bet in this node. And here we see some extremely high deviations, right? We saw, for example, facing with a small delay C-bet, people are overfolding by 13%. So that's the case of regulars. Recreational players folding less, but still overfolding. Facing half pots, again, massive deviations. Facing 3/4 bet, again, overfold. Facing over bet, again, overfold. Overfolded across the board on the turn there. And we also saw a problem in the bet check bet line. So after floating a small flop bet, turn goes check, check. Then when people check the river and face a bet, we still see some massive deviations here. And here's some things that are really sometimes even hard to believe. People folding overfolding by 13% against a half pot sizing, 10% or sometimes even more than that against overbet size. So some really sick deviations, right? So the first thing we're going to explore in this class is, well, how do we exploit this problem here? So I want to start hearing some ideas from you guys. How do we exploit this overfolding tendency by a population? What are the ideas you guys have for this? Jack Wilson says over bluff. Machias says, well, bet a lot. Michael says bet. Yannick says bet more. Okay, bet more, but how much more, right? I guess we can get very specific, right? Maybe we should bet more. Okay, but how much more? Agreed, says Ali. Norman says play those nodes more often with them. Makes sense. Never check. Increase the bet check bet line and check bet line with bluffs. Yeah, that makes sense. Shift all indifferent hands to bets, says Artem. What about the non-indifferent hands? If they're overfolding 5%, overbluff 5%. Interesting, what Henry says here. So he's saying we should be bluffing more proportionally to the overfold. That's an interesting thought. Brandon says, turned up aggression even more when board favors our range. Ellie says, can exploit multiple ways. What are those multiple ways? Give me some ideas. I want to hear. Matthias says, it depends on how much we want to exploit, right? Well, in this class, we're discussing max exploit, right? So in this class, we're discussing how to maximally exploit our opponents. That's going to be the focus of this week. Of course, there are multiple ways to approach exploitation or exploitative strategies. But throughout this week, particularly in this class and the following classes we're going to discuss how to maximally exploit, meaning what is the highest EV counter strategy against these deviations, okay? Bet the thresh earlier compared to better stuff. Interesting. We should not increase bluffs. Shouldn't we increase bluffs more than 5% and value bets more with a tiny size? So Bruno here is talking about perhaps not being aggressive proportionally to the overfold and perhaps changing our sizing with our value bets, right? That's something we have to discuss as well. When it comes to exploiting overfolds, we should not think only of the bluff part of a range, but also of the value bets. What changes to the value bets, right? If you want to max exploit the node, you can bet 100% if you have enough fold equity, right? Only check, not the hands. I don't know. You guys tell me. I'm only hearing at this point. But it could be. It could be. Give up some busted draws to show out of position, to show opponent we're not bluffing any, giving more credit for all of our other over bluffs. Nice. So Julian's talking here about perhaps not going all the way, not going max exploit, in order for us to not give too much information to our opponents so that our other bluffs would then make money, right? So this is a thought of a minimally exploitative approach, right? So we're going to talk about minimally exploitative approach next week with our classes on how to remain undetected. We're going to discuss next week. Wayne Harris says we could max exploit one way from button versus big blind and max exploit the other way, EPMP to balance. Interesting. So you're talking about different approaches to exploitation based on the positions. That's interesting. Norman says, all mixed hands become pure towards aggression? Probably, right? Depends on what size they are overfolding. Well, we saw that all sizes get overfolded, right? We saw that all sizes get overfolded, no exceptions. So we should also keep this in mind, right? Like, what size do we pick? It seems like people are overfolding to all sizes. So that's something we're going to have to talk about as well. Rodrigo says, modeling the overfold on appeal and see what solver does to max exploit. No guessing allowed. Nice. I like this guy. I like this. No guessing. I do not like guessing. We are both in the same page there. Value bet less unless we need protection. Interesting. I would bet 100% of hands that don't have enough equity to check back and don't suffer. But I don't know what equity that should be on the flop. 80% maybe. Especially since people are going to over probes or strong hands will make money like that. Pretty cool, guys. I like the ideas here. Some people already going a little bit one step ahead and talking about minimally exploitative strategies. Remember that this is what we're going to cover next week. This week, we're going to cover max exploit strategies. Okay, so exactly what is the highest possible strategy that we can take against these deviations from our opponents. Okay, so the idea here is We're going to play the way that maximally exploits those leaks and therefore gives us the highest amount of EV in response. Well, the obvious thing that you guys already talked about when it comes to exploiting over folds is that you get the river with the bluffing hand, you're going to want to pull the trigger, right? That's typically the first and most obvious adjustment you should make when you can account for the fact that people are going to be folding too much. Because if they are going to be folding too much, then immediately what we're going to see is that your bluffing hands are going to make money, right? So therefore, you should not hesitate to pull the trigger. You should go ahead and fire with your bluffing hand. So here's me fighting a almost 2.5x pot bet on the river against my opponent. So the discussion should start with, what do things look like in solver, right? When we take a look at solvers, when we take a look at optimal strategies, we see that typically there's almost always, I would say always pretty much, in order for it to be a GTO solution, there will always be a region of bluffing hands in your range that will be indifferent. So you're going to see, certainly if you browse sims, you're going to see in any bluffing spot a region of hands in your range that is indifferent between betting and checking, which means that they're making the exact same amount of money both by bluffing or by checking. Okay. What happens though when people overfold is that these hands are not indifferent. These hands, our opponents are not playing in ways that make our hands indifferent. Okay, so there is a more profitable play, which of course is the bluff. Well, this is very obvious, but let's try to get very specific with this. Let's try to get very precise and detailed so that there are no misunderstandings. Okay, this has to be very, very obvious to you guys. And to do this, we need to go back to the basics. We need to go back to understanding exactly the fundamental constructions that happens at equilibrium. And then from that fundamental understanding, we can build up our knowledge. Okay. Ellie says max exploit is dangerous. Yeah, we're gonna talk about that for sure. Okay, so what happens typically in GTO land? Okay, so we're gonna start the discussion with the GTO land with the equilibrium perspective. Typically, and almost always, in almost all nodes of the game tree, not particularly to rivers, but also on early streets, you're gonna have three regions of bluffing hands. Okay, you're gonna have a region of pure bets, you're gonna have a region of mixed strategies, and you're gonna have a region of pure checks. Okay, that's typically what you're gonna see in almost all nodes of the game tree, not only on the river, but also flops and turns. So here I have one example. This is a 10-8 deuce, deuce, king, run out, button versus big blind. Okay, so 10-8 deuce flop. Flop goes bet, small call. Turn goes bet, 2/3 call, or actually pot. And then river is a king. And this is the river strategy for the imposition player. Okay, so again, this is the river strategy in the triple barrel line for the imposition player, button versus big blind. If you take a look at a node like that, we're going to see these three different regions of hands. You can do that on your own in your studies. You're always going to find these three regions of hands. So for this particular board here, 10-8 deuce, deuce, king, we get to the river in the triple barrel line, and we see, for example, that a hand like Jack 4, both Jack, all of the Jack 4 suited combos here are pure betting. Of course, the highest frequently ones that get there are hearts and diamonds. But if you take a look at the other suits, they're also always betting. So these hands, they are making more money by betting than they are by checking. You see that they make a little bit of money by checking, but they make more money betting than they do checking. So these hands always bet. So we have a region of pure bets on the river with bluffs. Then if we look closer and we dig deeper into the range, we're going to find a region of mixed strategies. In this case here for the spot, it seems like hands like Queen Jack, Jack 9, Queen 9, which are missed gut shots on the river, they are all indifferent. They are all mixed strategies. So you see that they make same amount of money betting and checking. If you look closely to the numbers, it's not the exact EV, even though the hands are mixing. Always recall the fact that the sims that you see on solvers, they're not typically solved down to zero Nash distance, meaning that it's not the true equilibrium that you're seeing. So you might see some discrepancies where even a hand that is mixing, it's not the exact same EV you're seeing on your screen, but always recall that it is supposed to be the exact same EV. It's just that your sim is not solved down to zero Nash distance, okay? But we have here a region of mixed strategy hands. And if we continue looking, we're gonna find also a region of pure check hands. So in the case of this board here, we see a hand like Jack 7 is pure checking. So Jack 7 is a hand that does not want to bluff here on the river for some reason, right? So I want to ask you guys this. Why is it the fact that this happens? Why is it that there are these three different regions of hands? Why is it that some hands are pure bets, other hands are mixed strategies, and other hands are pure checks? Why is it that this happens at equilibrium? Combo properties, card removal, blocker effects, blockers unblock. Nice. Some hands block their folding range. Cool, 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 cool. So obviously, if hands are being played differently, it must be that they have different properties, right? This absolutely has to be the case. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. If they had all the same properties, then they would be played the same way. So the fact that they're not being played exactly the same, it means that they have different properties. Now, what I would like you guys to really comprehend on a fundamental level is that the reason why these hands must be played differently is because the bluff catcher range cannot target multiple regions at the same time. Okay, so we're gonna keep consistent with the terminology we have been using so far. And when considering the idea of indifference, recall that the same way that when you're bluffing, you're making your opponent's bluff catchers, or you should be trying to make your opponent's bluff catchers indifferent. When your opponent is bluff catching, he should try and make at least some region of bluffs in your range indifferent. Okay, he needs to target one region of bluffs in your range, and he needs to make at least one region of bluffs in your range indifferent. What happens is that when your opponent decides on a bluff catching strategy and decides to target one specific region of bluffs in your range, then that's it. He cannot target multiple regions at the same time with his bluff catching strategy. That's impossible. That's why there are always going to be these different regions of bluffing hands, because the opposition player, in this case, the bluff catcher range, is going to be target one specific region of bluffs in your range. And by the time that happens, these other regions are created. He makes one region indifferent, then regions with better properties become pure bluffs, regions with worse properties become pure checks. Okay, so this is what I want you guys to really have at the back of your mind as a fundamental understanding. The bluff catching strategy targets one region of your bluffing hands. Now, how do we make a bluff indifferent? Can you guys answer that? How do we make a bluff indifferent between betting and checking? What does that look like in terms of a strategy that makes a bluff indifferent? You fold enough? Okay, but how much is enough? Equity check and bet should be equal for that bluff. Okay, so EV. Okay, EV. Enough is enough. Norman already said something that makes sense, right? We're trying to make a hand indifferent, so we should make it so that the EV of bluffing is equal to the EV of checking, right? The penalty for being called is being outweighed by winning the pot. Yes, well, that's typically the That's typically the idea with bluffing, right? But remember that you have to make the V of calling, the V of bluffing the same as the V of checking. You should fold alpha. Okay, I was waiting for someone to talk about MDF principles. Zero EV bluff, conditional on blockers of the targeted bluff region, says Artem. Well, not necessarily zero EV, right? What if the bluff has some EV in the checking line? We need to account for that. And that's the problem when people talk about MDF. I talked about this when someone asked me about MDF on Discord. MDF that we see on books is for the specific situation when bluffs have zero EV on the river. And we're going to typically see that it's almost never the case that bluffs have zero EV on the river because they still have some tiny equity that they can check back and win on showdown. Okay? But you guys have the right ideas here. In order for us to make a bluff indifferent, we need to call at the exact frequency that makes the EV of betting equals to the EV of checking. Okay? In this example that I showed you guys here, if you look closely to your screen, you see that Queen Jack actually makes some money checking back in that spot. You see that it has an EV of 0.45 chip for specifically the Queen of Hearts, Jack of Spade combos that I'm looking at. It makes 0.45 big blind every time it checks back. So this hand does not have zero EV as a check, okay? So in order for you to make this particular hand indifferent between betting and checking, you need to make it so that the EV of betting is exactly 0.45, okay? So that's basically it. It's the basic math that is going to allow you to call it a frequency that makes the EV of betting and checking the same, okay? Matthias asked a question here. We need to protect our line. For example, have enough strong hands in the line when we have also bluff catchers. That's not necessarily always the case, but it's definitely a good idea for that to happen. We need to call the exact frequency that makes EV bet equals EV check. But also we need to get there with the correct range composition that can make that call without losing EV. I'm not sure I understand that statement, to be honest. Maybe you can rephrase. Well, let's continue here while you do rephrase. Let me get back to my slides here. So take a look at that. Let's calculate together the required folding frequency for you to make a hand like Queen of Hearts, Jacks of Spades here indifferent between betting and checking. Okay, as I said, this hand is making 0.45 chips every time it checks back on the river. So in order for us to make this hand indifferent, we need to call at a frequency that makes the EV of betting the same for this hand, okay? So how do we calculate the fold equity that makes the EV of bluffing equal to 0.5? How do we calculate that? Who can help me with the math here? And while you guys help me with the math, I'm going to reread Matthias' question. If we got to the wrong range composition, then we would be losing money even if we have the correct MDF. Because maybe we have not enough strong hands to be calling against the GTO strat. The strategy has to be with your whole range, not with just one hand, okay? So I guess that's what is weird in your question, because the correct folding frequency for us is the folding frequency with our whole range that makes our opponent's bluffs indifferent, right? Because from the perspective of our opponent's bluffs, he doesn't know what we have, right? He's gonna face a reaction from our whole range. So I'm still not necessarily getting what you mean. And I guess that solves the issue you're talking about, because you're going to always get to the river with a range composition that allows you to make your opponent's bluffs indifferent. If you play in a way that doesn't allow you to get to the river and make your opponent's bluffs indifferent, then yeah, you have done something wrong in a prior street. All right, but okay, who can help me with the math here? How do we make the EV of bluffing equal 0.5? How do we make the EV of bluffing equals 0.45? Because that's the EV of checking, right? So at equilibrium, we need to make this bluff indifferent. The bluff is making 0.5 on a check. We need to make the EV of betting equal to 0.45. How do we do that? How do we figure that frequency out? Zero point 0.45 divided by pot. I don't think this will allow us to get to the correct frequency. Put this hand into the equity solver versus opponent range. What do you mean equity solver versus opponent range? Equity solver. Come on, guys, help me out here. Is no one going to help me out with the math? How do we calculate what's the folding frequency required to make the EV of our opponent's bluffs, particularly this hand, right? To make the EV of bluffing with queen of hearts, jack of spades equals to 0.45. How do we calculate the EV of bluffing a hand? Artem says pot times fold equity minus bet times 1 minus pot equity equals 0.45. Nice. Very good. That's what we're looking for. So what's the EV of bluffing with the hand on the river? Well, what are the two things that can happen when you bluff? Either you get a fold or you don't get a fold, right? In terms of relevant scenarios for you, because in this case, if you're bluffing, if you get called or raised, it's the same. You're losing the amount you bet, right? So we can calculate the EV of bluffing by multiplying what we gain when we get a fold, which is, well, we gain the pot when we get a fold. So we multiply our fold equity times the pot. And then when we don't get a fold, which is 1 minus our fold equity, we lose our bet, right? So that's exactly what our friend Artem wrote in the chat. Okay, so fold equity times spot minus 1 minus fold equity times bet, that's the EV of bluffing. So if you want to find out what's the folding frequency required for us to make 0.45 chips with our bluff, that's what we should write, okay? So 0.45 equals fold equity times the pot. In the case of this hand here, the pot on the river is 26.1 chips. If you can take a look right up there on your screen, that's the pot size on the river, 26.1 big blinds. So when we get a fold, we win those 26.1 big blinds. And then when we don't get a fold, because we're betting pot, I forgot to mention that here, you can see with, well, there are multiple bet sizes, but the one being used the most is the pot size. So if we're going to be indifferent by betting pot, then this is the calculation. It's a very simple equation. You can solve it on your own, and you see that in the end, we get this folding frequency, 50.86%. So if the other position player folds 50.86%, then it means that Queen Jack will make 0.45 chips of EV with the bluff with the pot size, okay? Now, when we look into the out of position folding frequency versus the size, we don't see 50.86. We actually see 52.1. So what's the problem here? Why are we not seeing 50.86? Why is it that we're seeing 52.1? What's wrong here? Pot should be smaller due to rake. I think these simulations on the AI don't have rake. So it's not the rake. The bluff has non-zero equity. Not all bluffs zero equity. Well, what do you guys mean? Because we just calculated that for Queen Jack to be indifferent, the guy needs to fold 50-86, and then we see that it's folding 52.1. So Robert says combo versus range and not range versus range. Nice. Very good. Very good from Robert. That's exactly what's going on here. That's really important for you guys to understand these frequencies, okay? When I'm taking a look at the frequency, the aggregate frequency here on the solver, what we see is a unfiltered, without blocking effects frequency of the aggregate range, okay? So without considering blocker effects, then the upstream player is folding 51.1% of his total range. But recall that we're making Queen Jack indifferent here in our calculation. So this frequency is the frequency that Queen Jack specifically needs to perceive when it's bluffing. Recall that any different hand is going to have different blocker properties. So a Queen Jack, in this case here specifically, Queen of Heart, Jack of Spades, it has some blocker properties, and you got to make sure that from the perspective of those blockers, that 50.86 is your folding frequency. Okay, and you can see this. I think GTA Wizard you can't, but you can see this in PO Solver. You have this function in PO Solver where you can select a specific combo right there in the top right of the window. And if you click that box on, it's going to show you the frequencies from the perspective of one specific combo. Okay, so when we put exactly, and I copied the exact ranges here from GTA Wizard into PO Solver to make the analysis. And if we select exactly Queen of Heart, Jack of Spades, and we click that box, we see that the fold equity that this combo in particular perceives is exactly the fold equity that we calculated. Okay, so that's why this hand is being made indifferent, because from the perspective of this particular hand, it is facing exactly the amount of fold equity it needs to be indifferent. So if we take a look at these numbers for the different hands in the IP player's range, that's exactly what we see. In the case of the hand Jack 4 of Hearts, for example, that was pure betting. We see that if we select exactly Jack of Hearts, 4 of Hearts combo right there in the PO Solver feature, we see that it has 51.37% fold equity. That's pretty cool. And based on the equity this hand has, it would only need 50.51% to be indifferent. So that's why it's a hand is a pure bet. So you see that it has more fold equity than it needs to be indifferent. So it goes ahead and, of course, always bets because it's making money. Queen Jack specifically, we just saw, it needs exactly 50.87 to be indifferent, and it's getting exactly 50.87. So it's being played as a mixed strategy. And then a hand like Jack 7 of Clubs that we just saw before, that was pure checking, it needs 50.50 to be indifferent, but because of the blocker effects, the perceived fold equity from those blockers is only 49.53, so it is being played as a pure check. So we can see the effect of different blocker properties on the river. We see a shift of 2% almost between 2% in fold equity between the worst blocker hand and the best blocker hand. That's why blockers are relevant on the river. They're going to shift your fold equity a bit up or a bit down. So typically what we're going to see in real life, right, when we are playing against humans that overfold. So first of all, the region of pure bluffs that make some money in GTO land, they're going to make even more money in real life. That's pretty obvious, right? Then the region of hands that are mixed strategies, in GTO land that are indifferent. So 0 is not necessarily accurate there because they might be making a little bit more than 0, but the idea is that they are indifferent. Now, in the overfolded model, of course, they're going to make more money betting, so they're going to become pure bets. And then the last case, which is the case of the Jack 7 of Clubs we just saw, which has the pure checking, it's not necessarily clear what's going to happen with those hands because it depends on the magnitude of the overfold, okay? So these hands, they were not profitable as bluffs, or at least not as profitable as checking as bluffs in GTO land. And then with an overfold, anything could happen. They might still remain as not profitable bluffs. They may become zero EV or they may become positive EV. It depends on the magnitude of the overfold. Okay. So that's the basics here of understanding what happens when people overfold the river. In this extreme case here of Jack-7 clubs, we see here that bluffing with the pot size is losing 0.19 of big blind per hand. Okay, so the view of betting pot with Jack-7 of clubs at equilibrium there loses 0.19 chip. So if villain overfolds, but that overfold generates an EV lower than 0.19, then we would remain as a check with this hand, right? Nothing would change because the extra EV generated with the overfold is not enough for us to shift with that particular hand. If the overfold generates exactly 0.19, then it becomes a zero EV bluff. And then if it generates an EV higher than 0.19, it becomes a plus EV bluff. But even in that case, would not necessarily become a pure bet, right? Because checking is making 0.26. So if you wanted to shift this hand in particular from checking to betting, you would have to generate an extra EV of the sum of these two, right? So 0.19 plus 0.26, which in my head is 0.45, right? So if the overfold generated 0.45 extra EV, then the hand would become indifferent between betting and checking, okay? So far so good. Now let's take a look at a real example, right? Let's get off of the theoretical realm, the GTO realm. Let's talk about real numbers of the population. Okay, so here's where we're going to start using the information we have to make models in a solver by using the node locking function. Okay, so let's take a look at a big blind versus button, single raise pot. And let's take a look at the check call 30, check fold line by that opposition player. So facing a bet, check bet line. Okay. So this is the GTO strategy for the IP player on the river. Okay. So we skipped right there to the river. The board is King 7 deuce rainbow 9-3. So this is the board we're looking at, King 7 deuce 9-3. I made a model on the river with only two sizes to make it more readable for us to work with. Okay, so just two sides for the IP player, half pot and 3/4. Certainly GTO solution could include more, but here just to make it simple, just using these two sizes. So this is the GTO strategy for the AP player, and this is the performance of solver and already the numbers for the population. Okay, we see solver here facing a 3/4 size on the river, folds 45% of the time, and raises about 13% of the time. Notice the check raise size, which is quite funny. Optimally, you should have 8.21% of check shoves in the spot here. That's quite cool. The guy bets 6 blinds. You just shove 96 blinds in his face. That is GTO here on this note. And when we take a look at how regulars in particular perform here, we see that they fold 55% in this type of run out. So I selected specifically low card rivers on a high card board. So they fold 55% of the aggregate. And they check raise 7.6. So I have here a 10% overfold and about a 5.5% under check raise, which is quite significant there. Against the half pot size, we also have pretty significant deviations. We see solver folding 36% against a half pot reopen there. And again, pretty substantial check raise frequencies and sizes, about 15% check raise here with a lot of check shoves again. And in this case here, regulars are folding 51%, so about 15% overfold, and only check raising 7.8%. Okay. So recall here that this is already the locked model. So when we locked for these deviations, this is what we see of the solver response, okay? We see now half pot being used quite a lot. and even hands like ace queen, ace jack, ace 10 getting reopened with the half pot size here. Of course, a lot of different other deviations as well. The first thing we're going to observe here is that the air hands are making a lot of money, right? So that should be expected. Someone is overfolding by 15% to half pot size, 10% with three-quarter size. It should be expected that our air is going to make a lot of money, right? So on the top, you have the GTO solution. These hands making 2.1% of the pot when they bluff. There were quite a decent amount of pure bluffing hands in solver land. Let me get back this for you guys to see. So you see a bunch of bluffing hands actually making money in solver land. Okay, so you see hands like queen 5 suited, pure betting, which means that they're making more money better than checking. Hands like queen 10, queen jack, all making a little bit of money bluffing there. Okay, so in GTO land, these hands, they were making a little bit of money, 2.1% of the pot. And then against the overfold, they make 23% of the pot, which is quite insane, right? Matthias says 23, what the fuck? Yeah, that's how much money we can make against overfolds. So these are the hands that they were already making money at equilibrium, okay? So these hands, they were already making some money at equilibrium. Now they make more than 10 times more, okay? Then next, we have a region of mixed strategy hands. If you see quickly here in the solver model, the hands that were being indifferent between bet and check, you could see, for example, ace 4. Ace 4 is a hand that is indifferent between reopening as a bluff or checking for the AP player, and then a little bit of ace 8 as well. Well, this would be the strongest hand the IP player was bluffing with on the river. And when we take a look at specifically ace 4 on the river, it goes from making 2% of the pot to 22.3% of the pot. So again, more than 10 times more money with a region of mixed strategies. And of course, it becomes a pure bet, as you can see there, 100% bets with ace 4. I'm just going to play as maniac as possible after this class. Wait a second, guys. We're going to cover everything, okay? But yes, we should be very aggressive. That is definitely true. And then finally, there's a region of ace highs, right? Ace highs, they typically, on the river, they're not used as a bluff because they make a significant share of the pot by checking back, right? So when we take a look at those high card ace highs in the GTO land, so hands like ace queen, ace jack, those hands were making 22% of the pot in the check bet line, okay? So you see there in the top of your screen, they were making 22% of the pot by checking back because they had 22% equity against villain's checking range. In the overfolded model, they make 31.5% of the pot, which is quite insane. Very significant increase in their EV. So, well, moral of the story, if you want to exploit an overfolded population, you should overbluff. Okay, that's no surprise. But it can be a surprise how aggressive we should be with those overbluffs. So here you saw that a lot of the times you should take hands that are pure checks at equilibrium and start blasting off with bluffs. So hands that would make 22% of the pot at equilibrium, they can become more profitable as bluffs due to the population deviation, which is the case of ace queen, ace jack there. You see all of them just bluffing. So, obviously we should be over bluffing. We should be over bluffing by quite a lot. But there is more here as we're going to talk about. So even good showdown hands bluff. That's typically going to be the case for ace highs. Okay, ace highs on the river. In situations where solver checks, typically you should bluff against population, as we're going to see. EV generated from air and mixed strategy make the most money, though. What do you mean necessarily for your total range? I don't think you should be concerned with what makes the most money. You should maximize the EV of all the individual hands in your range, right? So the sim doesn't take into account the fact that on the river, villain will overprobe value. Would that change our strategy on the river if we put those inputs but remain the same amount of folds by him versus our bet? If we make a model where they overprobe value, then it would make even more of a bluff, right? Because now you have less EV. Well, actually, the opposite. Now you would have maybe, it actually depends, because the fact that people overprobe value, you should also take into account that they overprobe their bluffs. So you would have to see the composition of the river checking range to see whether you have more equity or less equity with an ace high hand, for example. I wouldn't be able to assume quickly whether against population we have more equity or less equity with an ace high hand. I would actually assume we have less equity than equilibrium with an ace high hand, because they just lead too much with their bluffs, right? So we have less EV in the check back line, and then we should bluff those hands for sure. Okay. So we should overbluff, but there's more here for us to understand, because we're talking about a river model here. And let's think about a spot where you're in doubt between double barreling or checking back the turn as the aggressor. Okay, so you're there on the turn, you have a decision between double barreling or checking. So in our GTO model, you could be in a situation like this where you are indifferent, right? So both the double barrel and the check decisions, they have a hypothetical EV of 2 chips here that I just put a random number for us to have something to work with. So both betting and checking make 2 chips of EV, and of course, if they make the same amount of money, you're indifferent, and you should be probably playing a mixed strategy at equilibrium. And then, the children nodes are going to compose the total EV of that parent node. So if the betting node has a total EV of 2, then that means that the children nodes are going to sum up to 2. So you have what happens when people call your bet, what happens when people fold, what happens when you get raised. I'll just throw out some random numbers there that would sum up to 2. Okay? But what's going to happen in practice is that there is a children node that is going to make more money, right? So if you take a look here, what I did, I just increased a little bit the EV of what happens when you get called. So instead of losing 8 blinds, now you're losing 5 blinds, which means that the parent node of betting has an increased EV, of course, because the parent node is just the sum of all the children nodes. So if you can expect to make a little bit more money when you get called, because you can overbluff river and get the overfold EV, now the parent node is making more money, which of course means that parent node should be preferred for your strategy because it's just more profitable than checking, right? So we can see this effect with a more advanced node locking model, which unfortunately is not possible to do by hand because it would require you to just node lock an insane amount of nodes. But I have a program that can allow me to node lock my opponent's folding frequencies on the river and see the effects on the prior streets. Okay. So for this particular example of this class, I took a 3-bet pot in position situation, and I node locked the out of position player. So this is going to be button versus hijack. Okay, so button versus hijack 3-bet pot. I node locked the out of position player to overfold a little bit by the river. Okay, so you can see on the top of your screen the GTO frequencies. PL Solver gives this cool function where you can see the aggregate frequency across all runouts. So the out of position player folding 57% of the time against the triple barrel. And I node locked the out of position player to actually fold 4% more, even a little bit less than 4% more against the triple barrel line. Okay. So what we see happening is in the double barrel node, which in the GTO land was played as a 60% bet, 40% check strategy. You can see that there in the highlighted area of your screen. 60% bet, 40% check back. When you account for your opponent's overfold on the river, this is the max exploit strategy on the turn. Ta-da! We double barrel 94% of the time. We only have 6% check backs on the turn. This is the max exploit double barrel strategy against someone who is expected to overfold the river by 4%. And then, well, if the strategy is obviously just a tree of nodes, right? If we can expect the the turn to have now more EV in the betting line, in the double barrel line, it means, of course, that there's more EV in the flop C bet line, right? So what happens in practice, even on the flop, is that your flop C bet strategy now goes from having 53% C bets with an EV of 7.17 big blinds per hand to a range bet spot. Okay, so you start now range betting as a max exploit strategy on the flop, then you double barrel 94% of the time on the turn because of the fact that your opponent is overfolding the river, right? So this maybe is obvious to some, maybe not so obvious to others, but poker is, you have to think of poker as literally a tree of decisions. And when you can expect a future children node to have more EV, that increases the EV of the parent nodes of that following children nodes, which means that on the top of the tree, you should be starting to use that option more often simply because it's higher EV, okay? So here we have an extreme case. It's actually not even an extreme case, but we just took one node, which is the overfold to the triple barrel, and we made the guy overfold by 4%, and that's enough to shift all the hands towards pure bet flop and pretty much pure bet turn, okay? Now I have no regrets. Oh, man. Yeah, typically we should not feel bad about bluffing. I'm certainly going to give you that. You should not feel guilty about bluffing against other people in real games. So we can get to a few initial conclusions about how to max exploit the tendency of the population to overfold, okay? The first thing is, of course, you should just fire all of your bluffs in the river. Given the magnitude of the deviation that people have, it is almost never going to be the case that checking with an air hand is a more profitable strategy for you in a vacuum, okay? We're going to, of course, discuss adjustments, but in a vacuum, in a unique random situation, there is obviously a lot of evidence to support that bluffing is the preferred play with any low equity hand on the river. And the second consequence from these models is that, of course, if we can expect those overfolds in the later street, we should bring more bluffs to the river, right? So we should play the prior streets more aggressive, and this will allow us to take advantage of those overfolds on the next streets, okay? Alice asking, which line is better? That's a very good question, and perhaps we're going to tackle that problem as well here. Now, another thing that we should be asking ourselves with regards to how to maximally exploit population and how to maximally exploit this tendency to overfold is, well, what size specifically should we use with our bluffs, okay? Because we saw the population overfolds to all sizes, but it is in fact possible for us to calculate what is the size that generates the highest EV for us, because we have the data for how much people fold against all sizes, right? So another thing that I've always been very concerned with my exploited strategies is, what is the sizing that maximizes my EV? I want to know that. Okay, so that's also very important. So, well, this is very easy to do, right? It's very easy to calculate what's going to be the EV of bluffing for a particular bet size. All you need is the fold frequency against that bet size. And we can get that fold frequency from the data. Okay, we can just access the data, see how much people are folding against each specific bet sizing, and then we calculate using this very simple formula what's the EV of betting with each specific bet size. So I'm going to give you guys a few examples of this. And the first one is the triple barrel line in single raise pots in position against regulars. And here we see a very, very clear trend in the data with regards to the best sizings to bluff. To be honest, I was surprised to see this data because in the past this was different, particularly for this line. But with the most recent data, this is what's happening here in the triple barrel node. There's a very clear preference for smaller bet sizes, and the bigger you bet, apparently, the less money you make with the bluffing hand against regs in this spot. It used to be the other way around. It used to be that the bigger you would bet, the more money you would make with the triple barrel line here. The first time I did this analysis. I think it was like 5 years ago or something, and the data was reversed. It was better to overbet in the spot than it was to bet smaller. Seems like the meta has shifted a little bit, and now the smaller size are better, particularly the half pot is better here, making 5 big blinds of EV. I calculated an average pot of 22 big blinds, I think, on the river in the triple barrel line, considering a small flop bet and then a medium turn bet, something like 22 blinds of pot on the river. And then we're making a quarter of the pot. We're making almost a quarter of the pot bluffing with the half pot sizing because people are folding 49% to a half pot bet on the river. And 1/3 size, very similar in EV, 2/3 size, very similar, and also close to pot size, similar in EV as well. Because harder to defend for people, I assume very small size. Yeah, I think qualitatively, that's typically when most people think, like small size is forcing a more difficult defense. But it didn't used to be that way. It used to be that 1.5x size was the best bluff size here. But that changed. That's why it's important to always keep updated with the trends and updated with the data. A very important disclaimer about, is that 50% size for all streets? No, this is for river, okay? So to calculate the EV, you're calculating the EV for typically the river. So what's the size you should use on the river to bluff? To calculate the EV for bluffing prior streets, it gets a little bit more complicated, although it's still doable. It's just that the math becomes a little bit bigger, but yeah, it should be still doable for most spots. One thing we should be careful with the data is that when we take a look at MDA and see, oh, regulars are folding 49% half pot bet on the river. Remember that different hands have different blocker properties. So you cannot assume that all of your hands will be able to enjoy 49% fold equity. When we take a look and see people are folding 49% to a bet on the river, we should take into account that, well, population has a certain triple barrel range construction, and typically value betting hands have decent removal towards bluff catchers. So if you value bet ace king on a king X board, you have a king which removes, of course, the bluff catches from your opponent. So typically we have the data is a little bit biased when it counts for overfolds. So a very good idea is to be a little bit conservative in your explorations of the data and assume that you're going to have about 3% less fold equity, okay? That's a margin I use for my studies because when you take a look at solvers, that's typically the maximum you see of a difference between the worst and the best blocker hand. So the worst blocker hand relative to the best blocker hand is typically going to see a 3% difference in the fold equity. So a very good idea is to be conservative with your model and assume 3% less fold equity on your bluffs. Okay, so I have a second screenshot here, which is a conservative model, assuming 3% less fold equity on all of those bet sizes. And we see that the bet sizes remain the same, half pot and 30% pot being really good as the triple barrel here, okay? Do we use the same size on the river for both value and bluffs? We're going to get to that. It's going to be the topic of our discussion in the next few minutes. In sites like ignition playing Zoom, how would you adapt that if you don't know if it's reg or not? You would only consider MDA when choosing bet size. You should always have some information, okay? So, for example, if you're playing against someone that has a full stack, you cannot say for sure that it's a regular or it's a fish, but you can assign a certain probability that it's a regular and it's a fish. Okay, so you should always use Bayes' theorem to at least assign certain probabilities for the profiles based on the evidence you have. Typically, the evidence is the stack size. Also, timings are typically very different between regulars and fish. And of course, bet sizes. Bet sizes like RFI size, 3-bet size, post-flop sizes. Fishes use a lot of 3x open raise. Regulars use a lot of 2.5. This is very distinct. Regulars use a lot of large 3-bets out of position. Fishes use very small 3-bets out of position. And fishes use a lot of half pots post-flop, and regulars use very rarely half pots. And regulars use overbets, and fishes don't use overbets. So you should always use that information to assign a certain probability of your opponent being irregular or not. Okay, that's quite important. All right, so in this conservative model, we see half pot is still the best size. That's the size I recommend you guys use in the triple barrel line as a bluff in a context of maximally exploitative strategies. Okay, when we take a look at recreational players, we also see that we can make money bluffing, and we see the same tendency. We see that smaller sizes typically better as a bluff. And you see that by the time we start overbetting, it actually becomes negative EV to bluff, which is quite interesting. So don't make the mistake of overbetting in this particular line, okay, triple barrel line against recreational players. But we are getting more full equity than you need to make a profit, particularly with hands that have very low equity. So we should go ahead and fire that third pot bet on the river and get those folds. Fishes playing better than Regs, yes. When it comes to defending on the river, fishes are certainly better than Regs for sure. So a very good and very safe, guidelines. Yeah, I guess guideline is a good word for it. A very good and very safe guideline for picking bluff sizes on the river is that in continued aggression lines, you want to go for typically small and medium sizes. So 30, 50, even 2/3 sometimes is okay, but more than that is typically not ideal. You're going to make less money with your bluff. And this discontinued aggression lines, you're going to typically want to size up because those are going to be more profitable bluff sizings for you. Okay, that's typically the case. All this data should be very sensitive to board texture. Differences are not that much. Board texture typically doesn't affect all that much these frequencies. I would only be careful with paired boards and ace high boards. In my research, those are the only ones that show, I would say not even significant, but something that should be accounted for. But in general, not something you should be concerned too much. So the last metric I wanted to cover here is the equity required to give up, which is a metric I decided to include here in these charts so that you guys have an idea of how, in fact, you should be a lot of times bluffing with hands that solver checks back. So basically the idea here is, well, we're making 5 big blinds bluffing. So how much equity would we need to have 5 big blinds on a check in this particular line? So we see here that to have 5 big blinds on the check in this line, you need 23.5% equity against your opponent's range to have 5 BB in the checking line in this line. So that is really, really hard to have, particularly in this continued aggression lines, right? So getting to the river with an ace high type hand, you should certainly fire against our opponents here. And then the bet check bet line, which was the line we saw a little bit before where we were bluffing ace queen and ace jack type combos. Take a look at that, right? that's a little bit crazy. In the bet check bet line, we see that opposite tendency. Seems like the bigger we bet, the more money we can make with our bluffs. And in this case, we should be turning hands with as much equity as 37%, which is pretty crazy. We're not going to talk much about the 3x pot bet because there was not all that much sample in the data. But the 2x had a decent amount of samples. So if you choose to bet with the 2x pot, you can expect to win 3 big blinds in this pot. In this pot, the pot is typically 8 big blinds, right? So you're making pretty substantial percentage of the pot. And if you have a hand with less than 37% equity, it means that you make more money bluffing than you do by checking, which is pretty crazy. If you take a look at that, I think that board we saw, King 7 Deuce, Ace Queen off on the river has 33% equity. So it makes more money bluffing than it does by checking, okay? So we can turn some very high equity hands into a bluff given how much people are folding. Of course, that is in a maximally exploitative scenario. Is bet check bet line and check bet bet line the same for sizes? I would imagine no. I haven't checked the check bet bet line, But you should always do the math and see what is the best size. It depends, of course, on the exact folding frequencies, okay? How much the flop bet size mattered in this line? Not much based on what I saw. Typically, you want to be as specific as you can with the size and sequence so that you get, of course, the most precise answer. But the flop size usually makes a difference of 1% on the folding frequency on the river. So it's generally not something huge. So another conclusion here when it comes to maximally exploitative strategies is that we're gonna want to turn showdown value ace highs into a bluff. Sometimes even low pairs with low equity, we might be able to turn into a bluff, okay? But ace highs, pretty much always, you should go ahead and bluff. Is the slide taking into consideration the 3% less folds? Yes, all slides with the conservative model, which is what I would prefer when making research, okay? And notice here there was a mistake in my slides here. I was supposed to show an example of me bluffing with an ace high hand, but it seems like I forgot to put the example here. But I can show you guys some examples later on Discord where you're gonna see me, even on my YouTube videos, you can see that me taking hands like ace high and turn into a bluff. And you can see me turning a pair as well. I just recalled that there's a video in my YouTube channel, how to make money bluffing with a pair. And I turned pocket eights into a bluff in a bet check bet line precisely because of this research here, okay? Yeah, eights versus nine, that's the exact hand. So I turned eights into a bluff in a queen jack 10 board and I got nines to fold. So when it comes to maximally exploiting over folds, again, we're talking about max exploit strategies here. We should first fire with our bluffs relentlessly, all streets. On the river, we should typically pick small sizings in continued aggression lines and overbet in discontinued. And we should also typically turn ace highs into a bluff, okay? These are very safe 3 conclusions we can get from the research and from the models, what we should do against population. If you do this, for sure, you're going to make substantial amounts of money bluffing population. More often than not, we're going to have a bluffing hand. So we might as well take advantage of the fact that people are not showing resistance. Showdown value, print more money betting when filled or over folding. Yeah, that's exactly what we are talking about here. Of course, depends on how much showdown value you're talking about, but ace highs, for example, you should bluff. Now, the next question, which a lot of you guys already asked about, is what to do with our value bets. Okay, this is also a significant concern when people think of overfolds, because the immediate thing most people have in mind when they see this or when they hear about overfolds is that, well, my opponent is overfolding, so I should size down to get more calls. That's a very typical rationalization that I see people having, okay? And Ali asks, value lose EV? For sure, right? So the way population plays, we don't make as much money with our value bets as we could if they were playing unexploitably. That's for sure, because people overfold under raise, so no matter what we do, our nutted hands would not make as much money as they could relative to equilibrium. But of course, our middling straight hands and our air makes more money than it should, so overall we can make more money, right? But unfortunately, the way people play, our value hands will always make less money than GTO unless something very specific happens. Is this one of the main factors that having a positive red line and blue line, the ace high bluff more than normal? I think to have a positive red line, you have to do a lot more than just bluff ace highs, but certainly bluffing ace highs is one of the things that are going to contribute to that for sure. But to have a positive red line, you have to do a lot more things, a lot more. All right, so villain overfolds, I should size down to get more calls, right? Well, no, not necessarily, okay? Not necessarily, because what this thought process fails to realize is that all sizes get overfolded, okay, guys? We just saw a bunch of data here showing, you guys saw last week, all sizes get overfolded. So to say that, oh, I'm not going to overbet because villain is going to overfold, so I'm going to size down and bet 75%, that's not a very accurate thought process because the 75% also gets overfolded. Okay? So it's not immediate that because people overfold, you should be sizing down to get more calls. You should also remember that by sizing down to get more calls, even though you might get called more frequently, you're making less money when you do get called because you're betting a smaller size. Okay? So we should not immediately assume that we should be sizing down with our value bets. Value are the backup over bluff range. Yes. Well, let's take a step back for a second here, okay? In a maximally exploitative strategy, we're not concerned with being balanced, right? So we don't necessarily need backups if we're concerned with only maximizing our EV. If we want to maximize our EV, we should just maximize the EV of all individual hands without necessarily a concern for balance, okay? So in the context of maximally exploited strategies, you should not be too concerned with whether your ranges are going to be balanced or not. Is there any kind of spots that you have already observed that field overcalls and river risk aggression? No. In the data, never. I think there are specific situations where this might happen, but from an exploitative perspective, like you're playing against someone who knows your strategy and somehow that person tries to adjust, then they might somehow overcall. But in the data, never. You're never going to see in the data, on the aggregate data, people overcalling against a specific line. So people will overfold to all sizes, and people also underraise, okay? A lot of the EV from betting small with another hand comes from the fact that you're going to get raised, or that you should get raised, both from bluffs and from worse value hands. But when our opponents don't raise enough versus smaller bets, then of course our nutty hands are not going to be able to enjoy as much EV. So again, you should not make the immediate conclusion that because people overfold, you should be sizing down to get more calls. That is not true, okay? So this is not correct. And we can take a look again at a real model to see this in practice. As someone said in the chat in the past, we do not need to guess. We can, in fact, build the models and see for ourselves. So let's take a look at the triple barrel line, button versus big blind, for 3 different sizes: 50% pot, 75% pot, and 100% pot on the river. We're going to see that on the river, as the in-position player here, if we solve with these 3 different sizes, there are a few distinct region of value hands. We see, for example, that hands like ace king, and again, the board is king 7 deuce 9 3. Okay, I'm keeping the board consistent here. Ace king is mixing all bet sizes. Pocket kings mixing all bet sizes. King 9 mixing all bet sizes. Pocket 9s mixing all bet sizes. So we have a region of value hands that make the same money with all sizes. Then we have a region of hands that are pure betting 100% pot, so the highest, the biggest sizing. So pocket 7s, pure pot, pocket aces, pure pot. Then we have one specific hand, pure betting with the 75 sizing. King 10 off is maximizing with the 3/4 sizing. And then we have a few hands that maximize with the half pot sizing. So king 6, king 5 are maximizing with the half pot sizing there on the river. So we have different regions of hands, different strategies with our value bets. But the question we're trying to answer is, what happens when out of position player overfolds and underraises? We can make that model and see. We don't have to guess. We can just build the model and see what happens. So the deviations we observe here from the population are like this. So against the half pot sizing, regulars fold 49% in this type of texture, and check raise 7.75%. Against 3/4, they fold 53 and check raise 6.5. And against pot, they fold 59 and check raise 4.9. All of those represent overfold and underraise. Okay, I didn't put the GTO numbers here, but all of these frequencies represent an overfold and an underraise relative to GTO. When we input these models into the solver and let it calculate the max EV strategy, we see this. We see this. So hands that were mixing, they pure bets 100% now. So those hands I mentioned, ace king, pocket kings, pocket nines, king nine, which were previously mixing all of the bet sizings, they are now pure betting with the bigger size. We also see something interesting, which is that a hand that was pure betting with the half pot sizing, which was king eight. So king eight here was pure betting with half pot sizing. It becomes a pure bet with the bigger size, 3/4 size. You see there on the left, king eight pure betting with the 3/4 size. And we see the weakest hand in our value betting range, king five, went from a pure half pot to a pure check back. Okay, so this is what happened here to the EV of our value bets. Here, what we're gonna see happening when we account for the population deviations. First of all, is that the fact that people overfold to all sizes is going to be very significant to us, because our concern should be, what is the size that gets the less disproportionate overfold? Okay, because that's going to be very important for our value betting strategy. Sometimes people are going to be folding disproportionately more often to a smaller size, which makes the smaller size less interesting exploitatively or in real life, because it's getting disproportionately more folds. That's the case with the half pot size in this line. See that the half pot size is the one that gets the more disproportionate overfold. So it's typically not a sizing that gets used by our value bets. So either we're going to size up, or we're going to take our weakest value bets in pure check with them. So the half pot size here, which is a smaller size, is actually the worst possible size with value here. We can see this effect by taking a look at the change in EV for a hand like pocket kings. So pocket kings in the GTO model on the right, we see that it makes obviously the exact same amount of money for all of the bet sizes. But in the overfold model, we see that the half pot size is the one that suffers the most. It's the one that has more EV loss from the fact that people both overfold and underraise. Okay, all bet sizes lose some EV. As I said, because of how population plays, our value bets are making less money. That's it is what it is, right? But all bet sizes, the half pot size is the one that loses the most, due to how people overfold disproportionately to that size and due to how they underraise. Another very good thing that happens with population, particularly in this line, but in some other lines as well, is that people underbluff with the check raise. So in this particular line here, people are significantly underbluffing with the check raise. So that's a good thing for our value bets, because now a lot of the times that they should be bet folding and being made indifferent, they're not getting bluffed, and therefore they can make a little bit more money when they bet, because they're not going to get bluffed by those out of position check raises. So they can just bet more often and fold to a raise. Okay, so adjusting our value bets, typically we're going to see these deviations here when we account for how people play. First, we should typically size up with nutty hands that bet small at equilibrium. Okay, the reason here is we rely on getting raised to maximize our EV with smaller bets. If we cannot expect to get raised enough, we should just be sizing up with our nutty hands. Okay, so that's very, very typical. All of the models you're gonna make for yourself, you're going to see this adjustment. Depending on how often people bluff with the check raise and how much they check raise, you may also see a check back with the bottom of the value bet range. So if people are folding way, way, way too much and not making up for that with a substantially massive underraise, then maybe the bottom of your check range is supposed to be turned into a check. Okay, I'm sorry, the bottom of your value bet range, you turn into a check. And then the other hands that are not necessarily the bottom of your value bet range and not necessarily the top of your range, the hands that are in the middle, you may size them up or down, depending, of course, on what is the size that gets the disproportionate overfold. In this case of this line here is the half pot size. The half pot size is getting the more disproportionate overfold. That's why it's not being used with the value bet. Out of all of the options, it's the one that is losing the most value when we do have a good hand. No bluffs with 100% bet size. No bluffs here with the pot size, precisely because the half pot size is the one generating highest EV. Okay, we already knew that, right? We already knew that from this slide right here. So we already knew that the half pot sizing was the highest EV with the bluff, so we didn't even need to make the model. Although sometimes blocker effects might change this. A hand might have a better blocker with the bigger bet size, and that might change the exact EV for that hand. But typically here, the best bet size half pot, so most of our bluffs will go into the half pot. It has the king deuce 100% bluff. Let's go back to that. I didn't see any king deuce. King deuce, where did you see king deuce? No, king deuce is a value bet. It's two pair. It's just value betting there. Okay. This is such a great point with the big bets with value, 100% something I have noticed. Awesome. Rely on getting raised, important part of EV for sure. For sure. I mean, if you have another hand in the size down, a lot of your EV comes from getting raised. Okay. So that's why typically smaller size are not going to be a good idea with our strongest hands. By that logic, are we going to see value bets going smaller in the discontinued bet line? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It depends on, of course, the frequency of raises. Okay. Funny how we could felt this playing some hands. I should be betting this weak top pair here, but I don't believe I'm getting called enough. For example, on GG net fast pool, nice C data to check with a clean line. Yeah, so for sure, sometimes our intuition is going to match reality, and we're going to be making good adjustments. But always check your intuition against data. Okay, that's an important thing as well, because sometimes our intuition might be way off. So you never know when it's off, when it's good. So make sure to check your intuition against data all times. Cool. So recapping here what we saw so far. If we want to max exploit this tendency of the population, we're going to be very aggressive with our bluffs. Typically, we're going to use small sizes by bluffing with continued lines and overbetting in discontinued lines. Typically, ace highs will make into the bluffing range, so even pure checking, ace highs that pure check at equilibrium should be put into the bluffing range exploitatively, given how people play it. We're also going to want to size up our nut hands that solver bets small with, because we're not going to make as much money with the smaller sizes, especially in continued aggression lines where the smaller sizes get disproportionately more folds. So we want to size up relative to solver. And we're going to adjust the other parts of our value bet range relative to the overfold. We want to avoid picking the size that gets the most disproportionate overfold. Okay. Unless, of course, some other variable comes into place. Now, let's continue our explorations, because we only talked about specifically exploiting the overfolds, but there are other deviations that we can exploit. We, of course, talked about some of the under raise as well, but we should be exploring some different nodes as well to see some other effects of how population plays. So I picked the lazy bet node for us to make an exploration together here, because this is a very relevant node that you can extrapolate the findings of this node to many similar nodes of the game tree. Okay, so I picked this board here, 8-7-7, with a queen on the turn. This is small blind versus big blind. Flop goes check, check. And this is the optimal GTO strategy on the turn right there. Okay, we see actually a very aggressive strategy on this card, which is nice. So 38% block bets. We see the presence of that depolarized strategy that I talked about last time. Some 2/3 bets, and then a little bit of overbetting, but not much. In this node here, the deviation of the population is insane. Okay, it's truly insane how poorly population plays this node. So this is the deviations of regulars in the spot. Against a 30% sizing, regulars will fold 42% and raise only 11. And I picked specifically high card turns on low boards. Against the 2/3 sizing, they fold 55 and raise 5. And against overbet, they fold 71 and raise 2.5. Let me ask you guys this. How do you feel we should be playing the what's the max exploit strategy against these deviations? What do you guys think? Give me your intuition based idea of what's a max exploit strategy against people playing like this, considering that they are, well, overfolding massively, under raising, etc. Probably check flop all bluffs and bet them on the turn. Cool. Well, let's think from the turn forward, right? Let's think from the turn forward first. Almost zero checks, value heavy, overbet, all bluffs 1/3, range delay small. Range betting, you guys feel like? Or do we have any checks at all here? Some big checks. Bet big with the nuts. We would check strong hands if villain will over pro river, right? Yeah, let's not consider the river probe for now. Let's just think of the turn deviation here and how that changes things for us. We're just isolating the turn deviation, okay? All right, so when we think of this, what we're gonna see is gonna be a little bit different from what we saw here, which is this. What we saw is a river IP situation, right? So we have to put money in with our value hands, otherwise, like, it's a river IP. If we check, the hand ends and we get no value. So here, despite the fact that people are massively overfolding, we have no choice but to put money in ourselves. When we account for the fact that people are massively overfolding and they're raising when we bet, in a spot where they have still the opportunity to put money to the pot for us if we check, that's the max exploit solver comes up with. Look at how beautiful. We pretty much check Queen X plus and we bet everything else, right? Very, very interesting. The max exploit strategy here, and it makes sense, right? Basically, what's happening here is the nodes where we bet ourselves, the value of betting yourselves with strong hands gets severely decreased because people are, of course, overfolding on the raising. But again, I modeled only the reaction versus the delay C bet, which means the other nodes are untouched. So the checking EV remains here, and then the betting EV goes down because people are overfolding on the raising. So of course, the highest EV play with the good hand is just check. And then every other hand, of course, is going to maximize with the betting. So we see here a very clear strategy where we basically just check good hands, bet bad hands, okay? We would check strong hands if villain, I'm sorry, just read that. So exploitable, yes. Max exploit strategies are by definition exploitable, right? Because we are doing whatever we can to maximize our DV of our strategy. But of course, yes, this is exploitable. Exactly how a rec would play. This is the strategy you should play if you want to maximize the EV of your range against population, okay? And this is exactly how I played for years in anonymous games. In anonymous games, I played a lot of anonymous games from 2017 until 2020. I played a lot of Bulldog anonymous games, and that's exactly how I played that position. Check strong hands, bet bluffing hands. And that's how I achieved a very high rate in those games, almost 7 BB per 100 in the games I played, because that's exactly what population incentivizes. It incentivizes us to check with strong hands and bet with our bluffs. Okay, so this is the max exploit strategy. We see strongest hands checking, and we see our unpaired hands getting a pretty significant boost in EV. So low pairs are getting a 14% boost in EV, and the unpaired hands getting a 79% boost in EV, which is pretty insane, right? Now, a disclaimer that needs to be made here is that this model is incomplete in a sense that it is only considering the deviation of the population on the turn. If you want to have a true max exploit strategy, we would have to account for all of the deviations of the population in all the different lines in the entirety of the post-flop game tree. Okay, that's what would be the most accurate possible max exploit strategy. Of course, that's impossible to build, unfortunately. Actually, it is possible, it's just very difficult. It would require a very specific computer program that would model the entire game tree for us. Maybe I'll build that in the future, who knows? But with the current technology, we can just do one node at a time. And that's what I decided to show you guys here. But a more precise and more complete model would include all the deviations of the population in all the different nodes. What I can tell you guys is that the way the population plays certainly further incentivizes this kind of max exploit strategy, okay? Because we know that when we check, they're going to overbluff. And when we bluff on the current street, they're still overfolding the next street, which don't ask me how that happens, but it does. People still overfold the next street even though they overfold the current. So after the lazy bet here and get called, you should still expect even more EV on the river because people will continue to overfold. So this further maximize the distance between betting and checking. You can expect much and more EV when you bet with the bluffing hand, and you can expect more EV when you check with the good hand. So typically, that's what you would want to do. This makes me want to play Iggy. Yeah, man, Ignition is good, I gotta say. This is dependent on the frequency of the villain's aggression in the next nodes. What do you mean exactly? Not sure I got your question. So this works experimentally as well. Yes, it did. Optimal river bluff size after 33 gets called. Against regulars, typically going to be over bet. Against fish, I think it's small. Okay. If people don't bluff enough, it's still worth it. You mean the check out of position with good hands? Yeah, it does, because the over bluff on the next street is just a bonus, right? The reason why checking with good hands is a better option is because when you bet yourself, people are just folding and not raising. So it's not so much that checking is better than betting. It's just that betting is so much worse than checking, you know? So you would prefer checking with the good hand. Now, when you're out of position, that's typically what you're going to want to do with the max exploit approach. Okay, you're going to lead all of your impaired hands. Typically, you're going to want to bet middling straight hands for small sizes, and you're going to want to check the top of your range. Okay, we didn't talk about it, but the middling straight hands, they're important to talk about here. So take a look at all those deuces through sixes, right? So deuces through sixes are hands that, and also the 8x combos as well. So deuces through sixes, 8x combos, they all, even though people are overfolding and raising, they benefit from those tendencies. So your middling straight hands are also going to go into your depolarized strategy. Betting is small. Okay. Now, of course, these are general guidelines. Okay. The max exploit strategy depends on the exact node spot. Then there are board texture differences, there are villain profile tendencies. So if you want to get as accurate as possible, you're going to want to do more models, take a look at the data for different scenarios and all of that. But it's not going to be too much different from this. It might be that in some scenarios, you may want to check this region. In some scenarios, you may want to bet this other region. But typically speaking, the way population plays, it further incentivizes slow playing good hands, and it further incentivizes betting with bad and middling straight hands. That's never going to not be true. The way population plays incentivizes you to slow play good hands and to be very aggressive with bad hands. Okay. Yes, we were the whole people there. If people are overfolding versus triple barrel, for instance, and also versus check bet bet, is not bet line a better max exploit line? The only way to answer that is by calculating. The only way to answer what is the best max EV line is to calculate. So it could be that bat check bat is better than bat 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 or check bat bat. The only way to know is calculating. Okay. And unfortunately, you're not going to have super precise models for this. You're just going to have to make some approximations, some simplified models. But you can do some calculations. I have done some calculations in the past that showed me, for example, that bat check batting as a bluff against the fish is typically better than bat bat betting. So I like to go bat check bat against fish rather than bat 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 because I've done some mathematical models that show me that it's likely better. But to know this or to answer this, the only way is to doing the math. Okay. All right, guys. So very good. Recall these are guidelines, but typically speaking, the way population plays, it further incentivizes extreme aggression with bad hands and typically slow playing good hands. That's typically what you're going to find with max exploit strategies. But both can be profitable, of course. Of course, both are going to be profitable. It's just that sometimes we want to know what's the most profitable, right? But of course, both will be profitable. Now, let's finish our class by discussing how to exploit the river over bluffs. We talked about the frequency deviations, how people are overfolding, how people are under raising, and how this incentivizes us to do all the things we covered so far in this class. But then we also have the situation of people over bluffing. You guys got access to the X-ray bluff catching sheet, which shows all of those lines and notes and sizing sequences where population is over bluffing. So, well, how do we exploit that? How do we exploit the fact that people are over bluffing? You guys give me some ideas here. What do we do against over bluffing opponents? Less raising with value on early streets. Nice. You guys are getting advanced. I like it. Check river with strong hands at a position. Slow play everything on the turn. Just call it a no. Overcall bluff catcher. Yeah, so the most, just like the bluffing example, where the most obvious adjustments is like bat more, bluff more against people that over bluff. The most obvious thing you're gonna think about at first is you're not gonna fold, right? You're just going to click the call button on the river, and that's of course exactly the case as a initial deviation. But as a lot of people are already saying here, the fact that people over bluff on the river is going to have implications on our prior street strategy. Okay, so this is also important. It seemed that they would put all their nuts in the check raise bet bet line, and their bluffs would go into the check raise bet and check raise check bet lines. I'm not sure I got that, honestly. Min click bet re raise bluff on river. Maybe could work. Yeah, if you have a hand that cannot call, maybe you could even bluff raise against someone over bluffing. That's definitely a good idea. Right, so just like the example of the bluffs or the situation of the bluffs that have three regions, right? So you're gonna have a region of pure bets, you're gonna have a region of pure mixed strategy bluffs, and then a region of pure check bluffs. The same is gonna happen with bluff catchers. Okay, on the river, you're gonna have a region of pure calls, you're gonna have a region of mixed strategy calls, and you're gonna have a region of pure folds. That's pretty much what you're gonna see in all of the river nodes at equilibrium. Okay, so here we have an example. I took the same board that we discussed at the lacy bet line, and I just made it get to the river. So it's 8-7-7 queen, and then a blank on the river. The IP player bet the turn, we call. Okay, that's the line. We check out of position. The IP player bets the turn, we call. River is a blank, we check, IP player bets. This is the OOP strategy on the river facing a 2/3 bet. Okay, so we can see clearly three regions of bluff catchers. We have first here a region of pure folds. So 4s, 5s, and 6s And this is something funny. Like, despite being technically a better hand than ace highs, those hands can never call, whereas ace highs are being played as mixed strategies. So ace 4, ace 5, ace 6, ace 9, ace jack, all mixing calls and folds. And then, of course, some 8x in there as well. And then there's a region of pure calls. So a few 8x combos with specific kickers, they are making money calling, so they are being played as pure calls, okay? The idea here is the same as in the bluff scenario, the bluff example. In the bluff example, the bluff catcher cannot target multiple bluffing regions at the same time. And here is the exact same thing, okay? So the bluffing range cannot target multiple bluff catchers at the same time. The bluffing range is targeting a specific region of bluff catchers. In this case here, the IP bluffing range is targeting the ace-x combos, okay? So because the bluffing range cannot target multiple regions at the same time, it has to pick one region to target and make indifferent. By the time it picks that region and targets that region, then hands with better properties, better blocker properties, are going to be pure calls. Hands with worse blocker properties are going to be pure folds. So we can take a look at that in practice. Against the 70% sizing, this is the optimal bluffing frequency to make a hand indifferent, okay, between calling and folding. If you bet 70% size, your optimal bluffing frequency, the amount of bluffs you should have into your betting range, is exactly 29.2% bluffs in your betting range. If we go to Range Explorer in PO Solver and you take a look at, how many bluffs does the IP player have in the 70% bet size? You take a look at that and you see, 29.6. That's not 29.2. Doesn't it need 29.2? Why does it show 29.6? Well, again, it's the same idea of the bluff catcher situation. We take a look at the folding range and we see, it's folding 52. No, but what's important is, what is the frequency from the perspective of the targeted hand? So from the perspective of the queen jack hand that was being targeted to be indifferent, it had the exact folding frequency required. And here's going to be the same thing. From the perspective of the bluff catchers that are being targeted, yes, they have exactly that amount of equity. So here we can see how much equity do these hands have versus the betting range. Well, exactly 29.2, which is what they need to be made indifferent. Okay, so because of their blocker effects, they perceive exactly 29.2 bluffs in the IP player's range. Then when we take a look at the hands that pure fold, well, because they're blockers, they perceive a little bit less equity. So you see that 6s, 5s, and 4s, they have actually 28.7% equity, which is, of course, less than what they need to be made indifferent for that bet size. So no surprise, they're going to pure fold. And then the hands that pure call, they have a little bit extra equity relative to what they need to be made indifferent. So that's why they are pure called. They can make a little bit of money. Okay? So again, the same principles repeat themselves. That's why it's important for us to understand equilibrium. But then when we take a look at how people behave in practice, regulars in particular are over bluffing this node by 12%. Right? So betting 70% of the river, regulars have 42% low pair or worse kind of hands here, which means that relative to what they need is 12, actually almost 13% over bluff in this spot. So when we model the position player over bluffing by this much, we see exactly this adjustment with all of these hands now making money in the calling line. Notice how King Jack off is making money calling there. That's pretty sick, right? King Jack off is making money against such a deviation because it is going to have the necessary equity to make money by calling on the river. So the typical deviation you're going to want to do is you're going to want to overcall. So you're going to want to take all of those hands and you want to call on the river. And then more than that, you're going to be able to bring that to your prior street strategy. So this is the strategy on the turn facing a bet. So here we are on the turn facing a bet, and all of those hands are mixed strategies. So ace-x making 0 EV as a call, and the low pocket pairs as well being different. But if you can expect an overbluff on the furthest street that increases the EV of the calling line, of course, now calling on the turn becomes profitable because you can capture that EV on the next street. So you should be, as a max exploit strategy, overcalling the prior street in order to maximize the EV of your total strategy. Okay, so the fact that population overbluffs not only should incentivize you to, of course, click call with your bluff catchers in the river, you should be calling more often on prior streets. You should be taking your bluff catchers that are close at equilibrium, and you should be calling with them on the prior streets to get the river node more often. Of course, click the call button on the river. Other adjustments you can make, as some of you guys said, is slow playing the top of your range. So the top of your range is likely going to maximize as a slow play instead of a check raise on the prior streets, because you can then expect those overbluffs the next street. All of those things are going to make sense from a early street adjustment to maximize your EV. Can't wait to see my HUD stats after playing a session like this. Yes, we should be extremely aggressive, guys. Not much folding and a lot of betting for sure. So conclusions. So far, what we saw in this class, you should be playing your bluffs extremely aggressive on streets. You should be betting small to middling strength hands whenever possible. They greatly benefit from the fact that people are going to be overfolding and under raising. You should typically slow play your nutty hands out of position and sometimes in position too. A classic spot where you can slow play your nutty hands in position is a delayed c-bet node. Okay, so you're there, button versus big blind. You have a nutty hand on the turn. You have to decide between delay c-betting or not. If you delay c-bet, people massively underraise and overfold. And then if you check back, they overbluff with the probe on the river. So slow play, very good option with your value there. Okay, and then finally overcall with your bluff catchers at all streets, particularly against recreational players. We should not be folding much against recreational players. If you find yourself in a spot where you're check folding against a recreational player, you probably made a mistake somewhere in the hand. Okay, because either you should have bluffed that hand prior, because it's a hand you cannot continue facing a bet, so you should just have bluffed it instead, or you have a bluff catcher and you should have called down all the way. Okay, so typically we should not be check folding post flop against recreational players, unless of course extreme circumstances. When they use very big bet sizes, we can then start affording to fold because they're not going to overbluff much. But apart from very large bet sizes, we should not have too many folds post flop. Okay, so these are going to be typical deviations you're going to have to deploy a max exploit strategy. Now, I'm sure you guys might be anxious to hear me say this, okay? There are scenarios where it makes sense for you to approach the game with the max exploit strategy. I don't think you should play all nodes, all scenarios, all pools against all players with a max exploit strategy. There are circumstances that I think this makes sense. First circumstance that makes a lot of sense for you to play max exploit strategy: anonymous games. Anonymous games, you should absolutely play max exploit strategies. Okay, unless some specific circumstances that, like it's a regular table in a high stakes game, so even though it's anonymous, you know the regulars have some very specific tendencies, and even the regular tables, that can be some HUDs that can get used. But other than that, like anonymous games, you should go for max exploit strategies. Against recreational players, in all situations, max exploit strategies. Okay, we should not be trying to balance our ranges against recreational players. We should not be randomizing our plays against recreational players. We should be playing max exploit strategies against recreational players. Other players that also recommend max exploit approach is against weak tight regulars. Those regulars that have like 45 on soft flop, people that overfold massive on the river, people that basically don't have a very good understanding of what are the typical thresholds for bluff catching, what are the typical bet size that should be used at equilibrium. Against weak tight regulars, you should go ahead and use max exploit strategies. I would not say always, but very often, max exploit approach against weak tight regulars. And also in big pools without HUDs. So the site is not anonymous, but there are no HUDs and the pool is quite big. So there are hundreds of players in the same pool and there are not HUDs available. In those situations, you should also apply a max exploit strategy in many nodes. Definitely not all the nodes, but certainly many, many nodes. So like the lazy bet nodes, bet check bet nodes. There's no reason not to approach those nodes with the max exploit approach. Okay, so these are circumstances where I recommend max exploit approach. Now, when I don't recommend max exploit approach, well, there are a few situations. First, when you're playing against someone who's better than you, it's probably not a great idea because you think you're outsmarting the guy, you think you're outplaying the guy, but then it might be that he's outplaying you. Okay, so against the best regulars at your limits, against someone whom you don't think you can win this game of exploitative strategies, probably you should not go with the max exploit approach. And also in small pools with HUDs. Okay, that's the case of many high stakes games. That's the case of some specific private games where there's a very small pool of players that know each other playing every day. So when you're playing in small pools with HUDs, then I do not recommend a max exploit approach. Okay. Does this also work in live games? Absolutely. I would say live games are the best situation for you to apply max exploit strategies. Okay. Man, Seek Value today, this information in 2 hours, so clean and so precise and so easy to assimilate. Impressive stuff. Thank you. Really appreciate the feedback, Matthias. Really means a lot, my friend. So this is it for today for this class. Tomorrow, I'm going to release a complementary video. Top 5 max exploit lines you should have in your game. Okay? I'm going to release that video tomorrow for you guys as a complement to this, as a complementary video to this class, where I'm going to show you guys specific lines that you must have in your maximally exploitative game. And then as usual on Thursday, we're going to have a plain explain demonstration where I'm going to show you these lines in real games. And on Wednesday, we're going to have a workshop on how to use node locking, which is the tool that I use to build these models you guys saw today. I'm going to show you guys exactly how to build these models and do these studies for yourself. What are the most effective and correct ways to use this tool, which in my opinion is a great tool you should know how to use. All right, my friends, this is it for today. Thanks, everyone. We see each other on Wednesday for our node locking workshop. Bye-bye, guys.